I can't quite see why this film needed to exist. Other than because why would you risk spending a hospital's worth of budget on making an original film that might possibly not make you back the annual GDP of Gambia in profit, when you can just remake a thing that already exists that you know would be successful because it already was once? Maybe. You could just re-update the graphics and sell it again. The Todd Howard strategy. It just works. The only thing this film really has going for it is the technical marvel of making animals look so realistic that they wouldn't feel out of place in a David Attenborough documentary. Although they are a little more floaty than they are in the documentaries. So the film kind of falls flat on its face even on that point. Oh dear, this film doesn't have anything going for it. Even though CGI without fail always ends up looking like 5 years later. They have done a really good job at making them look like animals. The lips even move at the same time some of the time.
Sarabi and I didn't see you at the presentation of Simba.
But credit where it's due, it does look really impressive. It is why it's the only selling point of the film. Which is kind of sad considering how these big studios treat these graphics guys. Like, remember the way they treated those guys who made the graphics for Life of Pi? You know, the ones who won the Oscar and then immediately went bankrupt. Well, not immediately. Right after they got jazzed off stage before they made the world aware of how much Hollywood actually fucks over all the actually talented people who make all this stuff.
Sadly, Rhythm and Hughes is suffering severe financial difficulties right now. I urge you all to remember.
And you can just see looking at this film all the hundreds of hours of overwork all these guys must have done to meet the deadline. And it seems like they were the only ones who were even trying. And it was all for nothing. Well, it did make $1 billion. But, you know. What I mean is it's not a memorable piece of artwork. And it kind of already exists. And it exists in a much more well-crafted way. I think a good film to compare this to is the new Jungle Book. They both kind of achieve the same thing. A needless remake of something that already exists, but in live action this time, and directed by Iron Man's assistant. Only this film having no people characters in it makes the live action thing seem a little extra pointless, as it's quite literally just the old film but with updated graphics. The Jungle Book, however, I liked. The performances were good, particularly the child, which is quite surprising because they're often very shit in films. And Bill Murray, which is a little less surprising because he's often good in shit films. Also, Christopher Walken as King Louis is surprisingly good, considering how not very good at singing he is.
Obi-Doo, I wanna be like you.
But his true talent is as a dancer, and you can't be that good at everything. It would be unfair on the rest of us. I like the mob boss vibes he had, and how different his interpretation of that character is compared to Louis Prima. And I was very ready to not like Christopher Walken's King Louis because I like Louis Prima. I did always find it weird though that they cast Louis Prima. I mean, I like Louis Prima, but considering they hired Louis Armstrong to write Bare Necessities, and he's a Louis too, and a trumpetist too. I mean, in trumpet terms, I think we all know who the King Louis is. I know you can say, oh, Disney being racist again, what a surprise.
Fortune cookie, always wrong. That's a hard one.
But maybe casting a black man as a monkey would have been worse. Prima is the more eccentric Louis, so it's not like it was a bad casting choice. It was a good move to have Christopher Walken singing that song in the credits, because even though he's not a very good singer, there is quite a lot of charm when coupled with those graphics that his singing has, which to me makes the end credits sequence the best part of the whole film. It's worth the ticket price alone, even if you didn't like anything else. Let's have a look at the titles in The Lion King. Oh, is that it? I guess it is it. The new Jungle Book also had a pretty good message. There's an environmentalist interpretation you can have about humanity's impact on nature, with scenes like the one where the boy runs through the forest with the fire and then turns around and realises that he's destroyed everything. Or maybe that's an anti-environmentalist message. You know, it kind of implies that if you use technology to help, then you might end up not helping so much. Or making it much, much worse. Fire counts as technology, right? Or maybe the message is just to accept who you are or some shit like that. I don't really remember much about the meaning of this film though, other than the circle of life, I guess. Or maybe that you can't escape your destiny, which is worries, maybe? What I find interesting about comparing these two films is, why do I like The Jungle Book more than this? They stylistically seem pretty identical, which with the same director doing the same concept they should do.
You know how hard I work for this shit? Do you know how my whole staff works? What sacrifices I make to make you happy, and then you just smugly just fucking shit on my shit?
But a live-action remake of The Jungle Book seems to make much more sense to me. And I think it's because we have an anchor point in The Jungle Book with the real live boy, which makes the whole live-action thing make a lot more sense. Your brain can justify the animals talking by thinking something like it's his imagination or he might be hallucinating or something. So I can suspend my disbelief and get past the uncanny valley filled with realistic animals that are so realistic and expressionless but can still speak English somehow. They sure sound friendly, but they do look like they want to eat me. But when it's just animals, it just feels weird. And I can only think it's because of that anchor point. Without a human character for us to relate the experience to, I can only help but think, is this what animals are really like when no one's around? Like in Toy Story? They're all singing and dancing and making lovely harmonies, and they are making lovely harmonies. But as soon as David Attenborough comes along to see what's what, boo! All shit breaks loose. Is this what I'm supposed to be thinking? Because it's what you've made me think about. Maybe The Jungle Book is just as terrible, but I like Bill Murray enough to give it a pass. That and those cool end credits I like. This film though, it feels very charmless and kind of bleak. The colours are very realistic, which is great, but also very, very boring. I mean, they don't even nearly give you the sense of awe that you get from the cartoons. Because the art style allows you to be less realistic, and more expressive and vibrant with the colours. You can be more creative with the colour in a way that wouldn't make sense if you were trying to be realistic. Which makes some of the set pieces look absolutely gorgeous. And like paintings. And I guess they kind of are like paintings. Whereas now they just look like photographs, which does make for a very nice desktop background. It's still good and impressive and lovely, but it's just not the same, is it? Even though I would say that the photorealism is so good that it's kind of boring, it is pretty good. I mean, it's so good that it just looks kind of normal. Apart from in any of the dark scenes where you haven't got a bloody clue what the hell's going on. That's definitely not quite so good. And with the final scene with the fire. Because of the need for realism, the flames don't have the same feeling of dread and chaos and anger that the cartoon has, where the fire swallows up everything, making it feel like the end of the world more than just a bushfire. Even the original CGI bit from the original film that was such a big deal back then, you know, the stampede, you feel a much greater sense of dread in the old film than you do in this one. All the feelings you're supposed to feel in this film just don't feel the same. It's like watching a cover band, but it's a cover film. It's kind of like how you remember it, but a little bit worse. Honestly, one of the last things I would have ever expected to see was Disney do Be Kind Rewind in real life.
I need you to say this line. I'm gonna piss on the graves of your ancestors. It's important to the story, Don't say that.
But here we are, in quite possibly the weirdest timeline we could have ever imagined. The music was about the only thing I liked in this film, and it did make me appreciate just how iconic a lot of the music is in this soundtrack. It's like this soundtrack and the Space Jam soundtrack are pretty much the 90s. Which is what I mean when I say I like the music. The performances in this film, not so much. I mean, the singing wasn't entirely terrible some of the time, but because it's the 21st century, the singers need to let you know just how good they are at singing by singing way too many notes. All at once. Because why sing just one note when you can sing 27? And I know that's just what modern music's like. I mean, how else are we going to know if they're a good singer if they don't go up and down the scale 7 times between 2 bars? And they go through so many notes, so they must be amazing. But it does get pretty old pretty fast. Yes, Beyonce, we all know you can sing, well done. Although I suppose since the songs already existed, how else is a singer going to maintain the illusion that they have any creative worth to add to the mix? If you can't add substance, just add more notes. It's not necessarily bad in itself. I mean, after all these music shows of singers doing this kind of shit all the time, I'm kinda numb to it, to be honest. I've been ground down to a resigned acceptance. But when you have that kind of singing, in a duet with John Oliver,
This child is getting wildly out of wing. Simba!
it's just... and Seth Rogen. To be fair to Seth Rogen though, he did give it a good try. I mean, he even did some harmonies, but still. At least with The Jungle Book, it never felt like they were trying to be good singers, or even like they needed to be. It makes sense for the characters. You can quite easily just imagine them singing like that anyway. It's like when they do the Bare Necessities song and it sounds like two people just singing together and goofing off. It feels like a natural scene, and not a well-rehearsed musical set piece that comes out of nowhere like when Scar starts singing. Which you can't quite imagine them singing like that anyway. Well, maybe Jeremy Irons' interpretation of Scar I can imagine singing like that anyway.
Oh, I shall practice my curtsy.
It's the background music I really like in this film, like in the scene where Simba talks to his father in the clouds. But, like, all that shit's in the original film too. I mean, it's all Hans Zimmer and he, did the original one too. It's just that, in this film, these musical moments are the only times that you ever actually feel feelings. Because you sure as f*** aren't going to be feeling feelings from how good the performances are. It's kind of impossible to know what the characters are feeling from their expressions, because they have none. And you really could in the cartoon, the art style was so expressive. So the only way you really get a feeling for what they're feeling is from the audio track, which isn't even of as good quality as you should expect for something that costs hundreds of millions of dollars to produce. I mean, the baboon guy feels like he's way too far away from the mic, which usually I don't think would go noticed, but because I'm supposed to be being impressed by the documentary-like realism of the talking animals, it just sometimes feels like they're not part of the world. It's not because they're recorded badly, it's probably because they're recorded too well. But because if you make a really realistic looking world, your brain then hyper-focuses on any of the things that don't fit in with that realism. You know, like reverb in a desert that sounds like a room, or floating feet. With a cartoon you can suspend that disbelief a bit easier, because it doesn't really matter. I mean, it still doesn't matter, but you know what I mean. If you're going for realism, anything, no matter how tiny, that distracts you from that realism or makes you feel like it isn't really real, really stands out. You know, the uncanny valley where it just feels a bit off. And kind of creepy. And it can be quite distracting from the story, and being impressed from all that realism. Like in that scene where Pumbaa nearly gets eaten by Nala. And then the two lions remember that they know each other and have a nice fun time whilst Timon and Pumbaa look really confused. You know, because they just nearly died. Can you tell they're confused? Because I can't tell they're confused. But in the cartoon, you don't even need the audio track to understand what they're feeling. Can you tell that they're confused? They seem confused to me. And I swear, did John Oliver record this on his phone? Did he record it between takes of his TV show? Did he do a second take, like, ever? If these were his best takes, how shit were the ones that they didn't use? Maybe they accidentally used the Skype recording instead? I do find it kind of interesting that all the recordings I thought were the worst were the ones that were done in a different studio. I don't think it's bad because they did anything particularly wrong or silly or anything. Maybe Jon Favreau just got tired of doing loads of shit takes.
Perfect. I think we could move on. You're pretty much nailing it.
Because John Oliver's done voiceover work in cartoons before and it's been just fine. But here...
Oh, I'm sorry. I got lost in the narrative, sire. Catching up quickly.
Even if it was just great takes, I think it would still be weird to have studio quality voices for your talking animals. The design was fine, I guess, for what it was. I mean, they do look like what they're supposed to look like. It doesn't mean it was a good idea, though. I mean, Scar and Simba look the same in the end. I had absolutely no idea which one was which in that final fight scene. And I'm pretty sure that's just bad storytelling. It's definitely design. I mean, look how dark it is, you can't tell who's who. But even in good lighting, it's not really obvious which one's which. Unless it's some kind of meta-commentary on how they're kind of the same. Maybe. But probably not. This is a good example of why CGI is usually in the dark. CGI in the dark looks a lot less uncanny. You can get away with a lot more because the shadows cover up a lot. To be fair though, the silhouetted fighting scene does look really, really good. The oranges and the blacks look amazing. Even though you can't tell who's who, it is very nice to look at. And that's still worth something, it is a visual medium after all. And you definitely can't tell the difference between Mufasa and adult Simba. You know, in that scene where Simba looks at his pond reflection and he turns into his dad. And he looks exactly the same and you can't tell that his reflection's changed. I suppose it still makes that point that he's a lot like his father. It's just done an awful lot worse. And they could have at least put Mufasa in the clouds. It's like making Galactus a cloud. It's just worse. It's unnecessary realism. And it's kind of weird where this line for acceptable realism is when you have the animals sing and dance. So, talking animals good, but talking cloud bad. Are those the rules for realism? The weirdest bit of unnecessary realism for me though was Rafiki's stick. The stick was part of his character, but here he doesn't have the stick at all. Until he brings it out in the scene where it's almost treated like a cameo. A reference to the good film. So they didn't want him to have the stick because it's not realistic enough. Okay, I get it, sure. Baboons don't carry staffs in the real world, so it's not realistic. But you still want to reference the old character design, so you introduce it like a cameo. That only makes sense if you've seen the original film before. And know that's actually part of his character design. I mean, sure, that's okay too. It's a bit weird, but okay. And then he uses it in the end anyway. In a fight scene where... Do baboons fight with sticks? In the real world? Is this still realistic? I'm almost certain it's not realistic. Which just makes him not having the stick for the rest of the film, for realism reasons, completely pointless. And they got rid of Rafiki's best part. That whole scene where he hits Simba on the head is missing.
It doesn't matter. It's in the past.
And that bit has like the best message of the whole film. You know that your past doesn't define you. Or at least it doesn't have to. And that even though it can be hurtful and painful, it can help you. It can help you to learn and to grow. If you choose to learn and to grow from your past experiences.
But the way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. Ah, you see?
Why is it always cartoon animals that have the best philosophical advice in films?
You are too concerned with what was and what will be. There's a saying. Yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift. That is why it is called the present.
Popular culture is so weird. What was the point in the realism? Why does it need to be realistic? Why does it need to be realistic when you're not even sticking to the realism? All this realism did for me was give me exactly the same sense of existential dread and anguish I get from watching documentaries. You know, when you watch an animal tear apart another animal, and then you spend the rest of your day thinking existence is pointless. Or you feel heaps of sympathetic anxiety for the antelope that's about to be murdered in front of you. And you feel really on edge. Well, you feel really on edge here too. Every time a lion pounces, it's terrifying, and it's supposed to be a kid's film. I just don't know why you need to go for realism. I mean, there's so much goofiness in this film, it's kind of silly. Timon and Pumbaa don't feel like they fit in with this film because the goofiness is too cartoonish for the aesthetic. It just looks odd. And they kind of play on that with admittedly the best line in the film.
Wanting more. Yeah, you've grown 400 pounds since we started.
Meanwhile, I look exactly the same.
Which is hilarious, but it kind of highlights what's bad about this film. They have this gritty realism mixed with some goofy fun that undermines the gritty realism. And it just feels so weird. It's like a postmodern realism. Although I suppose that's surrealism. And this is pretty damn surreal. I think even Salvador Dali would think it's a bit much. Like that bit right before the shit hits the fan for those forest animals and they're all singing together in time. It's really cute and really nicely harmonised. I just get such mad uncanny valley with this film. I even get it worse than in that Star Wars film where they reanimated Peter Cushing for no reason.
No! God, please, no! 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 No!
I found an artist who reworked a couple of the images so it had the old art style, but still had this modern CGI aesthetic to it. And I have to say, something like this would have been so much better. More expressive faces, more expressive eyes. You would actually be able to tell the emotions of the characters without having to just rely on the vocal performance or the music. And it would have made much more sense, and it would have been much less distracting. And there would have been much less uncanniness. And you might actually be able to tell which line was which. But hey, who knows, maybe in 15 years' time when they remake this thing again, it might look more like this. So we've got that to look forward to, I guess. Because this film felt so weird, and I wasn't taken away by the charm or the nice art style, because there is none, and because I don't really care how impressive CGI is, and it doesn't seduce me enough to distract me from how weird I find the film, I kept noticing flaws in the story which I'd never noticed before. For example, they highlighted that one part that wasn't a problem but made me feel like it was a problem in that scene that I mentioned earlier. You know that scene where I said it was admittedly the best line in the whole film?
Yeah, you've grown 400 pounds since we started.
Yeah, that bit. Well, I didn't like it. It either implies that they've been singing for a decade, or he aged 10 years in like an hour. Why? That whole thing is supposed to imply the passage of time and you've just ruined it for no reason. So now what wasn't a plot hole is now actually a plot hole. And all just for a joke. It's so dumb. I mean, it's funny and everything, but it's not really worth making a plot hole for. And the joke's only really funny in comparison to the rest of the film, which isn't really that funny.
Carefree days with us are history. In short, our pal.
And why would Simba blame himself when he knows that Scar took him to the gorge? Sure, he can gaslight all the others and maybe convince them that he's lying. Because it sounds like... never mind. But why would Simba be convinced? He knows Scar was the reason why he was there. I mean, I know if he just said, but hang on mate, how's this my fault? You told me to be here. You dickhead. He would have just set the hyenas on him and he wouldn't have had that head start. But it doesn't make any sense for him to think he killed his dad. But then I suppose that's the point of his grief, to irrationally blame himself. And to put him on the back foot before the final fight, for story reasons. To increase the tension. And to make the victory feel more cathartic. And so you can imagine him being eaten alive by hyenas and feel good about it afterwards. And also, children do often blame themselves for their traumatic experiences. So it is quite a relatable character flaw, which makes for a more sympathetic, relatable and realistic talking cartoon lion. And why are all these guys so happy that the new lion is born, when he's just going to eat them? I mean, I get they all worship this circle of life or whatever, but why are they that happy? It's got some mad Stockholm Syndrome vibes to it. Or conservative voter vibes. Yay, they want to kill me. It's kind of dark and a little bit depressing. The circle of life thing makes sense in the animal kingdom. And it makes sense in a documentary setting. But when you have anthropomorphic animals, it kind of implies that we're supposed to draw parallels to our own human society. And then it gets a little bit confusing. It starts to get weird. Is the circle of life supposed to teach us about nature? Or are you saying that we should have this philosophy? Because if we are, it kind of gives me justification of hierarchy vibes. You know, it's okay to be on the bottom of the hierarchy and exploited because when you die you get rewarded. Only in this, there isn't a reward really. They just get to eat grass. Isn't that why the only education they gave the slaves was Christianity? I don't mean to make them eat grass. I don't think that's required. Unless you're Presbyterian. Or is it Pescatarian? But, because it justified the hierarchy they were being oppressed by. Is the job of the Lion King to regulate genocide? Too much genocide is bad and makes the world go all grey and dry? But, if you genocide just the right amount of your civilians, it's paradise. Also, how does overhunting make the floor dry? Why does overhunting make the floor dry? This film's kind of stupid. It's not even fun to laugh at, it's just pointless. Why did it need to exist? Imagine all the better things you could get for $260 million. That's like 650 Napoleon Dynamites. Or like a hospital if you're more sensible. What am I saying? No one cares about other people. If you want to watch it, I'd honestly just recommend that you don't. Just watch the original. For all its flaws, it's much more well-crafted and enjoyable to watch. It's just a better experience. But this one, just leaves you feeling equally as hollow as the film is. Basically, it not good. Maybe just one last thing to conclude with. After going through this film loads of times to look for clips for this, and going through all those clips over and over and over again, this film just gets worse and worse. I don't know what you were thinking, John. I honestly thought when I first watched this film that the graphics weren't actually that bad. I mean, I still didn't get it. I don't know why you would call animation live action. And the whole documentary vibe that he was going for just didn't work for me with all the singing and all the silly shit. But I did genuinely think that the graphics were pretty good, and they look pretty okay as animals in a documentary. But seriously, I must be stupider than I thought. If you look at it twice, it's so much worse. Like, look at all the daytime parts, they look absolutely shit. There's no excuse for it to look that bad. That scene from Rush perfectly encapsulates everything I think about this.
It's amazing, all these facilities and you make a piece of crap like this.
Just replace Ferrari with Disney and it's literally this. Nothing feels natural at all. Nothing looks like it interacts with anything in the world. And it's way more than just the floatiness. It's like, it all looks like shit green screen. Like, what even is this? You're not touching anything? Or is the bark just like super smooth? And then the trees, oh my god, the trees. The plants and the trees look so shit. Why are they this bad? And they just look worse and worse every time that you look at it. It looks like assets from a PlayStation game. I mean, I'll get it if there was a couple of little bits which were a bit iffy. You know, someone had an off day or it was like 5 to 5 on a Friday. But it's like the whole fucking thing was done at 5 to 5 on a Friday. It's just a shame that they couldn't have had the whole film in the dark, because that was the only time the CGI looked any good. Everything about this shit show is an utter clusterfuck. What a fucking waste of money. And on a positive, I guess.
And then you just smugly just fucking shit on my shit. It hurts. Yes. It fucking hurts when you write that shit. It hurt you.
It does. It does.